Welcome to this PowerPoint presentation on the relationship between stereotyping and prejudice. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that prejudice is perhaps the most serious problem faced by societies around the world today. Of course, this has always been true, but as the population increases around the world, it becomes more and more of an issue. You'd be hard-pressed to find any society on the face of the earth today where there isn't tension and animosity between groups of people based upon their ethnic origin, their race, their religion, or some other characteristic that distinguishes one group from another. Let me start by defining some terms. The words prejudice and discrimination often get used interchangeably, but they're very different things. Prejudice is usually defined as a negative attitude toward a specific group of people, which causes us to evaluate individuals from that group negatively just because they belong to that group. In other words, you don't know anything about the individual, but you assume all kinds of bad things about him or her just because of the group that they come from. Sometimes you hear people talking about somebody being prejudiced in your favor, like the umpire at the game was prejudiced in our favor. But that's a misuse of the term. By definition, prejudice is always a negative attitude. Discrimination, on the other hand, is a negative behavior directed at members of a different group. The two things, prejudice and discrimination, often go together, but they don't necessarily. For example, it might be possible to have an individual who harbors prejudice toward a different group of people, but he or she doesn't actively engage in any discriminatory behavior. On the other hand, you could also have an individual who regularly discriminates against people from a different group, but doesn't actually harbor any prejudice towards people from that group. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later on. So, prejudice is an attitude. Discrimination is a behavior. Prejudice can be explicit or implicit in nature. Explicit prejudice is prejudice that an individual is aware that he or she has, and they are aware of the link between it and their behavior. So they know they hate certain people, they know they have negative attitudes about them, and they know that their behavior falls in lines with this. Implicit prejudice, on the other hand, is a bias that one has toward a group of people, but you're not consciously aware that you have that bias. You think of yourself as an unprejudiced person who harbors no negative feelings toward any group, and yet your behavior reveals that, given the right circumstances, you will in fact discriminate against other people because of prejudicial feelings that you may not even be aware that you hold. So prejudice can be very upfront or much more subtle in nature. In the United States, the most blatant and socially problematic kind of prejudice is probably racial prejudice, and specifically racial prejudice by white Americans against African Americans. And this reflects our terrible history of race relationships that began with African Americans being imported as slaves to North America, and then even after the Civil War, the long and tragic and brutal history, much of which is just coming to light. The recent Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, provided an opportunity to talk about the racial massacre that occurred there in 1921. And all of the recent events in the news, the systemic police brutality against especially African American men, is a persistent social problem, and it's tearing us apart. And that's one of the things you'll be studying about in this chapter. In spite of some of the recent examples of brutal police behavior against young African American men, overall, explicit overt racial prejudice does seem to be on the decline in the United States, but the more subtle, implicit, or automatic racial prejudice is unfortunately alive and well. It's very clear that white Americans are still most likely to discriminate against people of another race, but they're especially likely to do so in situations where they can be blissfully unaware that prejudice is a motive, and they may not even know that they're behaving in a discriminatory fashion. So if you look at patterns of discrimination in employment, or when people display favoritism toward others, they're almost always discriminating against people different from themselves and showing favoritism toward people who are similar to themselves. And all of the stuff that we've been discussing when it comes to policing. Black men are much more likely to be reported as being suspicious even when they're not doing anything, and the police deal with them much more harshly on average. And in the justice system, they receive stiffer penalties for crimes compared to white offenders. And in day-to-day life, we're more likely to report shoplifting and other trivial things if it's a black person that we think is doing this rather than a white person. In juries, we're much more likely to give breaks to people of our own race. So this prejudice is everywhere. And in fact, it's so pervasive that it's even gotten a name. We call it modern racism because it's the way that it usually manifests itself. And if you look at subtle little things, even things as trivial as who the Power Ranger characters were in the kids shows from some years back. Of course, the black Power Ranger had to be black, and the yellow Power Ranger had to be Asian. So let's talk about the process of stereotyping. Stereotyping is the first step in developing prejudice. Now, I want to begin by saying that everybody stereotypes. Stereotyping is a cognitive shortcut that we use to make judgments about people so we can predict their behavior, and we rely heavily on stereotypes in situations where we don't have a lot of other information about the individual that we're dealing with. Stereotypes are not necessarily bad, but when they are negative, they can very quickly lead to prejudice. So holding stereotypes in and of itself does not make a person prejudiced, but having stereotypes is a negative first step toward developing prejudice. There's a very uncomfortable but funny video clip that you can see by clicking on the link on this page, Skinheads from Maine. There's also a link on the web page for the class. And it's a clip that's making fun of prejudice and stereotyping by relying on stereotypes about people from Maine. So by all means, take a look at it. So in the process of stereotyping, there are really three stages that we go through. First of all, we have to identify a category of persons. You can't be prejudiced against a group if you don't have a mental representation of those people as constituting a single group. So we have to have a cubicle in our mind for Jews, for Muslims, for blacks, for women, for gay people. And the category is the first step. Secondly, there has to be some agreement, at least agreement among you and the other people in what we would think of as your reference group, as to what set of traits or characteristics go along with that category. In other words, you and people like you must be in agreement as to what the typical person from that group is like. The third step occurs when you meet an individual from that group and assume that that individual has all of the traits and characteristics that you believe to be part of that category. Now, the question about stereotypes in general is a very uncomfortable one because it has to dance around several different issues. Are there in fact real differences between groups of people? And if there are stereotypes necessarily factually incorrect or illogical or something that only prejudiced people hold? Can we think about stereotypes as being probabilistic predictions of differences between groups? And how can we really know if there are differences between groups of people? There are a couple of ways in which psychologists have tried to attack that question with, I think, questionable degrees of success. One thing we can do is to measure what's called a heterostereotype, the beliefs you have about another group of people, and an autostereotype, which is the beliefs that you have about your own group. And if you find that there's a lot of agreement between heterostereotypes and autostereotypes, well, maybe there's some accuracy to that stereotype. In other words, if what other people think of your group is in agreement with what the people in the group think about themselves, maybe there's a kernel of truth there. Part of the problem with this is there's some research, some of which I have conducted myself, which shows that our autostereotypes, our beliefs about what our own group is like, are very susceptible to change depending upon the experiences that you have. And so if autostereotypes can be easily changed and are kind of flimsy, should we really be using those as the anchor to talk about whether a group has certain characteristics or not? Another technique is to use what we would call a convergent validity approach, where you measure the heterostereotypes that many different groups have about a target group. And if all of those groups are in agreement, if they all have the same set of beliefs, perhaps that's evidence that the group does in fact have those kind of characteristics. But I want to emphasize that all of this is very iffy and very difficult to pin down. So the extent to which stereotypes reflect actual differences between groups is still very much an open question. And it's not really relevant to the problem of prejudice that we're talking about in this chapter. Research has consistently shown that prejudice are deeply rooted and pervasive. They're very resistant to change. And so over generations, the stereotypes that we have about certain groups tend to be very similar. Recent research has indicated that people are less willing to admit to holding stereotypes, but when you can get them to describe stereotypes that they have, they're very much the very same stereotypes that their grandparents and great-grandparents would have used. As I talk about this, I have a slide up that depicts an Irish stereotype based on my own ethnic background. And yeah, this is a very persistent way of thinking about Irish people. We have very strong and persistent gender stereotypes as well. We expect men and women to be different from each other in very consistent and predictable ways. Your textbook talks about this in quite a bit of detail, and when I'm teaching this course in person, we spend a fair bit of time talking about it. I'm not going to spend as much time on it in this online course. But if you click on the picture on this slide, you will see a very entertaining clip from the old TV show Friends, which shows what we expect from men and what we expect from women and how they're different in a particular situation. You can also find a link to this clip on the web page for this section of the class. Similarly, there's a very fun Italian cartoon that makes fun of these gender stereotypes that I think you'll enjoy, and you can see that clip by clicking on the picture on this page or by going to the link on the web page for the class. So stereotypes matter for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that they can lead to prejudice. But another fairly recently identified but a very important side effect of stereotypes is something that's known as stereotype threat. When an individual finds him or herself in a situation where the stereotype about their group is on the line, where they're expected to be a certain way, there's this fear of confirming a negative stereotype that can undermine your own behavior. So if you belong to a group of people that others don't think of as intellectually capable, if you're put into a situation where you have to demonstrate how smart you are, you will not perform as well simply because you know that that stereotype's out there and it eats away at your ability to do well. One of the pioneers of this concept of stereotype threat is a psychologist by the name of Claude Steele. And if you click on the link on this slide, you can see a clip a couple minutes long of Claude Steele talking about the nature of stereotype threat. And I guess I'm going to say that this is something you do need to watch. and it'll be much better for you to hear about stereotype threat from Claude Steele himself than from me. So make sure you take a look at the video.